certainly will respond, comment, will add their own thoughts, and we'll some more Q&A afterwards and so forth. To my far left, Eduardo Crespi. He's the executive director of Central Latino, which he founded 12 years ago. It's an organization committed to empowering immigrants, to helping them get settled in the Columbia area. For the past 2 years, under Eduardo's leadership, Central Latino also initiated the Comedor Popular, or People's Diner. God, my Spanish is terrible, sorry. I took French in high school. Which he will talk more about during his comments. It's located in the Labor Temple on Gar Street. Eduardo is also a registered nurse specializing in public health. And in 2003, he worked with the National Library of Medicine in Washington, D.C. He currently works for the Heartland Self-Equity Council, which is committed to address and end health disparities among minority populations. And the council is an initiative of the U.S. Office of Minority Health within the Department of Health. And Eduardo immigrated to the United States from Argentina 21 years ago. Our next panelist, Amany, and I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Good, very good.
All right. Is an assistant clinical professor and supervisor of the externship program at the St. Louis University School of Law. She teaches lawyering practice and traditional ethics and court procedure in the legal clinics program, and has taught an Islamic law seminar, all since joining the SLU faculty in 2007. Professor Hackett is a member of the Center for International and Comparative Law and is co-founder of the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations. She has written and spoken extensively on Muslims and Arabs in the United States. Prior to joining the SLU faculty, she practiced law at 2 private firms focusing on complex civil litigation and appellate advocacy. And while in private practice, she received the David J. Dixon Award for Excellence in Appellate Advocacy from the Missouri Bar Foundation. Amany received her bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, her JD from St. Louis University in 1997, where she graduated cum laude, and her MA from St. Louis University as well. Stephen Downs is the executive director of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is dedicated to eliminating preemptive prosecution, profiling, and prisoner abuse. He spent most of his legal career as the chief attorney for the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct, disciplining judges for misconduct. He retired in 2003, and in 2006, volunteered to be part of the defense team for Yassin Arif, a local imam charged with terrorism-related offenses. After Arif and his co-defendant were convicted and sentenced to 15 years, Steve Downs became convinced that the U.S. government had deliberately convicted an innocent man in a process known as preemptive prosecution. It changed his life. He soon afterwards became a founding member of the Muslim Solidarity Committee to raise money and help take care of the 2 families and 10 children of the defendants. And when other similar cases of preemptive prosecution were discovered, Steve Downs became a co-founder of Project Salam, dedicated to documenting all of the cases of preemptive prosecution in a database and advocating for the release of the defendants. Project Salam is now following over 800 cases in its database. In 2010, Project Salam became one of 18 founding members of the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Steve Downs graduated from Cornell Law School in 1969 after previously serving for 2 years in the American Peace Corps in India. He lives in Albany, New York. To my near left is Redditt Hudson. He worked for 5 years as an officer with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, serving on a neighborhood beat with the street crime unit, and as a detective in the intelligence unit. From 2000 to just a few weeks ago, he worked with the Eastern Missouri ACLU. He served as the racial justice manager before becoming a program associate with the group. One of his most significant accomplishments was his principal authoring of Suffering in Silence, an in-depth 2009 report examining conditions in the St. Louis City Jail and focusing on human rights violations, including sexual and physical violence endured by those incarcerated. The report prompted St. Louis Police Department to institute a more proactive policy to curb abuse in jail. Redditt Hudson has been a leader with the Justice for Reggie campaign, drawing international attention to the plight of Reggie Clemens, who has lived under a death sentence in Missouri for about 2 decades. Redditt has been an active and outspoken leader in the struggle to end the death penalty and received his undergraduate degree from St. Louis University as well. The panelists will offer comments for about 8 minutes, and then they will engage in Q&A. I don't know who decided to go first, so I'll leave that up to you. You go
first. First, I'd like to congratulate Mr. Greenwald. That was excellent. I mean, that is the most. understand expression of things that many of us in this room, I'm sure, agree with, that I've heard in a long time. And it's good to be in a setting like this. As I mentioned to you before we started, the last time I was in a setting like this, we were discussing racial profiling. My colleague, John Chasnoff, who's with the ACLU of Eastern Missouri, is also here. But I was at St. Louis University's law school there to debate Nathan Sales, who broke the Patriot Act. Yeah. So this is a nice change of things. let me just say, I am a former police officer. I've been shot at enforcing the laws of this state. I worked in St. Louis, which, if you follow any news media, you know it's a fairly dangerous city, but I resigned my position. Although law enforcement is a noble profession, I resigned my position because I was so profoundly disillusioned with the criminal justice system in the United States and the conduct of some of my colleagues in particular. And I'm going to go to the issue of race because I think, that is a layer that you discussed, and it is where most of my work has been focused since I left the department. A 3 or 4 years ago now, the congressman in the district that I live in, the 1st District, Congressman Lacy Clay, convened a conference of law enforcement leaders, chiefs of police from various municipalities in his district, which includes St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and some other places, to talk about the issue of profiling because his office had been receiving a huge amount of complaints. And I remember going to that conference very intentional with what I wanted to do. And I brought a videotape that I had made on the 4th of July. It was interesting to hear you talk about our founders, the principles, rule of law. I had to take a statement. It wasn't a deposition. I'm not an attorney, but it was a statement that I was going to hand over to our attorneys from a young man named Anthony Collins. He's African American. At the time, I guess Anthony was about 22, 23 years old. And he was describing an incident that had taken place in St. Louis City with St. Louis City Police. He was driving down the street one evening. I think they had set up some kind of a checkpoint. I don't know if it was for DUI or what. They just had a checkpoint where they were randomly stopping cars going through a certain intersection, a certain place. And he arrived at this intersection and was motioned by an officer to, stop, and he was giving him some other gestures. But Anthony wasn't very clear on what he wanted him to do. So the officer, you could see him becoming more animated. He lets the window down. The officer is shouting something at him. He still doesn't understand. So he gets out of his car to get closer to the officer so he can hear his directive and comply. For whatever reason, the officer didn't want him to get out of his car, and he was ordering him back to the car. Get back in your, I won't use the language that the officer used, but it was colorful, according to Anthony. Get back in your fill-in-the-blank car. But Anthony wanted to know what he needed to do because he had some place to be. He didn't get back in his car. The officer gets to him, and ultimately it escalates, and the officer assaults him. And he beats him up pretty good. He maces him up pretty good. Anthony's having trouble breathing. He's having a hard time, and he's been assaulted. A superior officer, a sergeant, responds to the scene. They're about to charge Anthony with resisting arrest. If you ever see that, that's boilerplate for the police whooped you, but we need a charge for you. So you resisted our attempt to arrest you, and something else. At some point during the encounter, he had been refused medical treatment, which he asked for, of course. At some point, I don't remember exactly when, it's been some years now since and I'm showing this, mind you, I'm showing this videotaped interview on a screen to a room full of police chiefs and police officers. At some point, the decision was made to allow him to get medical treatment and to allow him to continue on. They unarrested him, if you will. And the point at which that decision was made was when they realized that they were causing him a delay, which in turn would cause him to miss a flight back to Iraq for his second tour of duty in the U.S. Army. But on the tape, to hear Anthony describe that this isn't the first time this has happened to me or my friends, and describe the history of his experience, in many cases the collective experience of minority communities with law enforcement agencies, how he'd been treated from the time he was this big all the way through, even though he did everything right. Great student, great character. His mother was even targeted at various points in her life. He would describe that. And I knew I had done a couple of things. I knew that I had taken away the thing that is usually available to us as police officers when you challenge our behavior, which is our preferred narrative. Wait a minute, now I put my life on the line every day. If you were ever in my shoes and you had to make a decision like I have, you wouldn't ever question anything that I do. I had taken that from them. The other part of the narrative, as you mentioned earlier in your remarks, that if you challenge the behavior of law enforcement in this country, somehow that makes you unpatriotic, anti-law enforcement, pro-criminal, anti-everything that's right and good. I took that from them and forced a real dialogue. When you talk about solutions, forcing a real dialogue at this point in our nation's history, I think the opportunity is there. Everything he said to me was plain truth, simple truth, easy to grasp, easy to understand. The challenge then is what the other gentleman said, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? And my hope is that this is the generation that first gets more comfortable with acknowledging the complicated history of our country. Yes, it's a great country. Yes, we love our country. No, it isn't perfect. Yes, it's okay to say that. Yes, it's okay to point out those areas where we have been flawed. And race, of course, has been central to that. The way to make that discussion easier, the way to take some of that tension out when we get to those discussions of race is to acknowledge this, that the conditions you're describing, or that I'm describing, that we have to address, are the fault of no one in this room. We were born into this reality. These conditions pre-exist all of us. It is not an indictment of any white person in this room, for example, for me to criticize the inequities, the severe inequities that are legislated into our laws everywhere. Missouri, patting itself on the back right now for finally coming into compliance with the federal guideline relative to crack cocaine sentencing of 18 to 1. Yeah. And we clap for that, almost instinctively. 18 to 1, that's a good thing. No, it's not. No, it's not. How about equal treatment under the law? How about 1 to 1? You know what I mean? But, like I said, it's nobody's fault. Our responsibility becomes to do something about it. And the political leverage that is available to people, not even in those high offices that you described. Let me know when I'm getting close to 8 minutes.
Yeah, 2 left.
2 left. Not even in those high offices, but the political leverage is available to people, even on the local level, on the state level. You know how much political leverage there is for somebody holding office or running for office, standing up in front of people saying, I'm tough on crime, especially in our cities. I did a report, the report you referenced, which was triggered by a young man named Cedric Cross, who had been so brutally beaten in a St. Louis jail. And mind you, jails are where we hold people over sometimes for a trial, which means guilt or innocence has yet to be determined, innocent until proven guilty, who had been so severely beaten in a jail that he crawled out of it upon his release, down Tucker Boulevard, right across from our city hall. If you can imagine an inmate that crawls on all fours down a main street to police headquarters and asks them to get him an ambulance. That's how bad he was beaten. They called the ambulance, take him to Moyers Jewish Hospital in St. Louis. The doctors look at him and say, you have to have surgery immediately. His internal injuries were that severe. We report that out into the mainstream, and it's a yarner. Oh, he's a criminal anyway. Look at where he's from. You know, St. Louis is a dangerous city. we got to do something about those people anyway. What do you want? You want them to be at the Ritz-Carlton or something like that? Our reaction. So we have to accept responsibility for first acknowledging the truth that's been presented to us, and then find that courage that's in all of us to actually do something about it. Let's hold each other accountable for making this country everything that we want it to be. And I think we're moving in that direction inevitably. I think just because the population is changing so rapidly that the diversity itself, I think, will force. When the minority becomes a majority, I think a new conversation is going to be forced about who populates our prisons, how our laws are enforced, and how people are treated in every process where we should be equally valued.
Wow, what a great audience. The National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms is a coalition of 20 Muslim and civil rights organizations that came together because of concerns about three campaigns: profiling, preemptive prosecution, and prisoner abuse, solitary confinement. And Redditt here has given a really good, I think, description of the kind of problem that profiling represents for a large number of people all across this country. You all have a pretty good sense of that, so I'm not going to take the time to deal with that now. I want to talk to you about preemptive prosecution and solitary confinement, which is one of our focuses. And I brought with me my storyboard here. This is 150 some odd cases that we are following of this. And it is important for me to bring it because I want everybody to understand that we're not engaged in a theoretical discussion here. These are real people serving very long sentences, 25, 30, 40 life sentences for things that basically never happened. And we have to understand this as part of what Glenn Greenwald was talking about in terms of how the law has shifted. We are no longer operating under an equal justice system. This is a way of generating the fear that he talked about that is necessary to maintain the kind of situation that we have. How did it happen? Well, after 9/11, the FBI was charged with preventing the next terrorist attack. And how, after all, does the FBI know who is going to commit a terrorist attack until the attack occurs? And I think the way the FBI solved this, or at least one of the ways, was to start to look at people's ideology, on the theory that ideology predicts criminal behavior. If you pray too fervently at the mosque, if you use jihad and paradise in the same sentence too many times, someone who's listening in will get the idea that maybe you're a danger. There is a 1% chance that you might engage in terrorism. And then you have to be taken down. You have to be locked up to prevent the crime from happening. And that is what preemptive prosecution is all about. It is about prosecuting somebody for a contrived or made-up charge to prevent them from committing a real crime based on their ideology. Have we ever had this kind of experience before? Well, back in the 60s and 70s, we went through a period called COINTELPRO. How many people in this place remember COINTELPRO? All right, this is interesting. I'd love to see 100% of the hands go up, but this is part of what I'm out here trying to do, educate. This was a period of time in which the FBI was concerned that people with strong ideological feelings, Puerto Rican national movement, Indian national movement, Black Panthers particularly, really one of them, would be a threat to the stable order. Their actual charge, I think, was to go after any group that had the potential for violence. And if you can imagine, is it possible for the FBI to spin a situation in which almost any group, including a library group or a women's garden club, might have a potential for violence, and they can do that. And then they went after them. They had participated in targeted assassinations, in framed murder charges, in disrupting meetings. I have some of the names here on the board. Until finally in 1976, a church committee in Congress said, look, this has got to stop. It can never happen in a democracy that a government makes war on its own people over the ideology. And they put in place various rules to prevent this from ever happening again. And to some extent, the rules worked. That's controversial how well, up until 9/11. And after 9/11, these rules came off. And so I would argue that we are now back into the COINTELPRO era. This is a new COINTELPRO, I argue, on steroids. How does it actually work? Well, I say there are three facets to it. I just want to quickly go over those I have here. One is that the government passed various laws called material support for terrorism laws. And these laws make it a crime to engage or have any contact with certain designated foreign terrorist organizations, regardless of your intent. Even if your intent is to relieve suffering, even if it is to prevent terrorism, it would still be illegal. And just a couple of quick examples, charities. After 9/11, all of the Muslim charities were shut down. Money was taken by the US government, and then they went after the directors on material support for terrorism charges. In the Holy Land Foundation case, for example, they were building schools and hospitals in Palestine, and although the government conceded that no money had gone to any terrorist group in this foundation, the directors were nonetheless convicted of material support for terrorism because the schools and hospitals added to the prestige of Hamas, and that constituted material support for terrorism. And now Hassan al-Awlaki here is spending 68 years in jail, so it's essentially a lifetime sentence. They're doing essentially compassionate work. There was a group out in the Midwest that decided to engage in peacemaking. They were peacemakers. They went out and they would meet in conflicted areas. Palestine was one. And the government, these are the red guys over there, the government is now going after them on material support for terrorism charges because even though they were meeting with different groups, trying to bring about peace, that was material support for terrorism as well. Another problem is free speech. We all think we have free speech. But I have a number of people up here, Tariq Mahana, Ali Timimi, Shifa Siddiqui. These are people that basically took positions on the internet to the effect that the Muslim countries, and I'm kind of conflating a couple of cases here, that Muslim nations had the right, indeed the duty, to repel foreign invaders and be independent on their own, foreign occupiers, including the United States. That was enough to get them locked up for 20, 30 more years. Al-Timimi is in jail for life in solitary confinement. That is how, and that was from one meeting right after 9/11 when they were talking about what the Muslims should do about the situation. The same problem, they've gone after animal rights activists, environmentalists. The point of these laws is that they are unfair because they criminalize things that none of us think of as criminal, and indeed most of us think of as laudatory. And there is no notice that this is criminal, and so it is a perfect way to ensnare, to entrap people and have them locked up. If you cannot find a way, the government cannot find a way to lock you up on a material support charge, they very often will assign an agent provocateur to go in and try to get you locked up. And one of the ways they do that, I'll just cite a couple of quick examples here. Tariq Shah, famous bass player, for some reason they decided to go after him, and they got a guy who, after several years of trying, became his very best friend, took bass lessons from him, and then finally moved into his house and lived with him for a number of months while carrying around a tape recorder and trying to goad him and talk him into saying enough that could get him convicted. And eventually he succeeded, and now he's spending 22 years in jail. In the Newburgh 4 case, the government offered $250,000 if they would bomb a synagogue. These were the poorest kids you can imagine. Now, the price for bombing a building, I'm sure, is not $250,000. You could probably get it for $8,000 or so in most cities on an arson. But that's not what the government wanted. They wanted a bunch of kids that they could claim were terrorists. And they were willing to pay that amount of money to get these people so they could say, these are terrorists and you better be really afraid. Well, anyway, these are some of the cases, and I have to move along. I just wanted to say something about solitary confinement, because once these people are charged with material support for terrorism, one of the first things that happens is that they are thrown immediately into solitary confinement, pre-trial. Now, you know, under the Geneva Conventions, you are not supposed to keep anyone in solitary confinement for more than 30 days because it's so debilitating. It is extremely painful. There are panic attacks. There is a sense of complete losing of your mind, the ability to talk. As one person said, it is a daily struggle every day to hold on to your sanity. So they're put into solitary confinement, and they're kept there for years. The most famous case was Mohammed Morsami, who ended up in 5.5 years in jail in solitary confinement pre-trial, until he finally said to the government, I can't stand it anymore, I'm going crazy, I will plead guilty to anything you want. And once he pled guilty, they let him out. I could go through some of them more. Once you are convicted, then you often go to a special Muslim prison in the middle of the United States called a Communication Management Unit. It's mostly Muslim, it's not entirely Muslim. But the idea is that it is designed to segregate these people and isolate them so that this ideology will never get out, will not contaminate the rest of the country. And they're held there, oftentimes in solitary confinement for life for very long periods of time. And I think the government is putting them there under these very restrictive conditions, hoping that people will forget them. And I have to say that it is the mission of the National Coalition to make sure that none of these people are forgotten, that these cases are remembered. And I've had people that have called me up and said, my appeals are exhausted, I have no place else to go in the legal system, please put me on your wall, I don't want to be forgotten. And that's what we are trying to do. We have programs to follow these families, to make sure the families are all right, that the prisoners are good, that we introduce legislation to get them out, we have educational events, and so on. So thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Glenn, and the distinguished panel and this wonderful audience. I'm so glad we're all here to talk about some very serious issues. Now, as Glenn mentioned, these are hard topics to talk about, and they're hard topics to live with. I'm here today. I'm a lawyer. I'm a Muslim. I'm an Arab. I'm an American. I'm a naturalized citizen. And so these issues are very real to me in maybe a different way. And so it's important that we spend some time to talk about them. I do want to tell you that I am my nature is more of an optimist. And so it's hard today after reading Glenn's book, no offense, Glenn, and sitting here and talking and of course I knew all of these things and I know all of these things and I live these things. It's another thing to kind of see it all in one place. And it's hard to do, but I think it's important. And I highly recommend the book, by the way. Are you selling them here? Oh, okay, absolutely. Do that. It's a great book. Read the book. Buy it for your friends. Think about these issues. And while we know a lot of the history that's in there, it's reflected in such a way that really makes you think about it from a different lens. And I think that's really important. So I don't have a lot of time, and I've prepared a lot of remarks, so I'm going to just cut a lot of this and really cut to the chase and talk about, we know generally being a Muslim after 9/11, right, over the last 10, 12 years, before 9/11, there was a small group of us in St. Louis just before, it was actually just a few months before 9/11, we'd sat around and talked about, well, we really need to be more active in our communities. We're Muslims and we should be more present, we should be more aware in our communities, and what can we do? And so we got together and started the St. Louis chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and those were good times. We're young professionals, single, and having a good time. We got T-shirts that said Muslims Care, CAIR, and clean the highway, and we, built houses with habitat. It was such a nice, peaceful, fun time. And our theory was very simple, right? If people saw us in the community and saw us contributing, that they would think of us as members of their community, that we would be like them. We would not be foreign or different. And it was a simple theory, and we thought it was going quite well. And then September 11th happened. Right? And so our theory just really got flushed down the toilet. We went from, thinking about trash in the highways to dealing with, kids in high schools and elementary schools who are getting beat up, to thinking about, parents who were scared to walk their kids to school, and parents who were losing their jobs, right? Just for being Muslim, right? And actually being overtly Muslim, right? You can look at someone and say, oh, they're Muslim or not Muslim. That was a presumption. And so, we were really, again, we were trying to do very simple things, and there were a couple lawyers in the group, but really we had no experience with anything like this, and we were really quite overwhelmed. And so we had to roll up our sleeves and figure out what are we going to do? We have to, our mission, our purpose here has changed. And really that's what happened to Muslims in this country. We went from being silent and invisible to being hyper-visible. And we can't afford that luxury of invisibility anymore. Little did we know this was a luxury, right? We can't afford that anymore. And so we have to start telling our own story and be a part of a community and culture in a different way. And it's, we weren't raised that way. My parents, I'm an immigrant, my parents are immigrants, we were raised to be quiet. You don't talk about where you're from and what you believe. We want to fit in. And looking at me and my name, it's not that easy. There's, some challenges along the way, right? But we tried, and the silence didn't work. Silence is never going to work, right? So it's important to be here and put these issues out on the table. Now, our community is struggling, right, in lots of ways, and we have lots of professionals in our community. In terms of socioeconomic class, we have the gamut, right? We have all sorts of professionals. We have people who work in factories, we have people that drive cabs, we have people that really run the gamut in our community. And they're all affected by this. And I think reading your book and thinking about the elitism that's in there, we have this aspect of elitism. If you're educated and you're a professional, no one's going to bother you, right? If you go to your doctor, many of you probably have Muslim doctors, right? Maybe you may know other Muslim engineers and professionals in this society. And so you think, oh, well, I'm not like them. No one's going to come and arrest me for being a terrorist. I save lives. I'm a firefighter. I'm a police officer. I'm a lawyer or a doctor. And that's not the case. History tells us that's not the case. And so we kind of have to educate our own community and say, look, we have to get out there ahead of this. What are we going to talk about? We need to educate the educated about civil rights in this country. They don't understand what can happen to them and what can't happen to them, what they can ask for and what they can't. And so what happens, I think, is a generational gap, there's an economic gap. And you go to these Muslim conferences, and there's lots of different groups that put them on. A big one is Islamic Society in North America. They put a big conference on every year. They typically have a big government speaker that comes in, and I don't want to say dog and pony show, but lots of good, we're here for you, and civil rights. And I think in many respects there are. There's some very high-profile cases where the DOJ and the government has prosecuted and brought cases on behalf of Muslims fighting for, there's a famous case out of Berkeley where a Muslim woman wanted to take off paid leave to go on Hajj, right? And so they brought that case. The EEOC brings lots of cases on behalf of lots of religious groups. This should not have been a big deal, like, whoa, this is great. This is what they do. This is what we do, defending the Constitution, protecting people's rights and the right to practice their religion. So some of the controversy surrounding that case was, the government is not interested in enshrining Sharia law into our society, right? So now the federal government has to say, no, we're not here, holding one religious law above another. We are talking about the protections of religious law overall. So they kind of felt some of the heat that we feel, right? Which is kind of an interesting situation to be in. The federal government, yes, there are some things there are some lawsuits and some, so again, I'm an optimist, right? There are some lawsuits that have gone forth on behalf of Muslims. On the flip side of that, of course, you have, you mentioned a little bit about the FBI and the role of the FBI and some troubling things that have been happening. I don't know if any of you have heard of Operation Flex. Raise your hand if you've heard of Operation Flex. Okay, so thankfully a few of you have, but you can Google, Operation Flex. You can get on Public Radio International. It's This American Life. They did a really wonderful job of documenting sort of what happened in that story. I don't have a lot of time to just give you the highlights, but I do want you to listen to it if you get a chance. And what's interesting is the producer, the person leading the show, kept saying, this is not a typical FBI situation. This is not typical. Saying it's not typical. It's not typical. But then he went on to just, research and investigate and discuss the details of this sort of ludicrous thing that happened. So this is Orange County. The FBI puts a large Caucasian man, and this is important for the story because the story, it's called Operation Flex for a reason. So you have this large 6'2", almost 300-pound male who's essentially a bodybuilder. Okay, and the FBI brings him in and says, we want you to spy on Muslims in these mosques in this area. And so he goes in And he converts and he befriends some people in the mosque, and he spends months in this community. And he starts hanging out with a few of the young men. Some of them approach him and say, "Hey, how are you doing? You're a convert. How's it going? Any questions? Call us." Very typical, right? And so he engages these young men and a bunch of single Egyptian men living near the mosque, and they start playing Xbox for hours, and they hang out at night. They eat, they become very friendly. They live this sort of calming life together. And as time goes on, he starts bringing up lots of interesting questions. Out of nowhere, he starts saying, "Tell me about jihad. Tell me more about jihad. We should do something. We should do something in this country. What's wrong with this country? We're just sitting here. We're so apathetic." And he starts sort of introducing these ideas. And by his own admission, it's his introduction of these topics. And so one day, he's in the car with two Muslim men and on the way to the mosque, and he says, "I have access to weapons, and I think we need to do something. Let's blow something up." And so these men in the car just like they're stunned, right? They don't know what to do. They can't believe this is happening. This is like a skit. This can't be real. And so they're silent. They get out of the car, and later that day they call the local chapter of CARE, which is the Council on American Islamic Relations for Orange County. And that person knows, of course, and works closely with the FBI in Orange County. Calls the officer that he knows in charge and says, "Hey, this is what's happening. We're really concerned about this. Got some information. And this is the situation," describing the fellow and what he said. And the FBI agent goes on for minutes to say, "You know what, I'm so glad you told me about this. This is exactly what our relationship is supposed to be doing. We're relationship building. You're telling us this is important. Thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it." And he says, "Okay, well, I have the fellow's name. Do you want his name?" I have his address. He said, "No, I don't need his name or that." And he said, "What?" Okay, so they got off the phone. And come to find out, of course, that this was the informant that the FBI had placed in this local mosque. So he knew exactly who it was, and he knew exactly what was going on. And so this community, and this FBI agent had gone to this mosque and several mosques, and this happens in St. Louis. The FBI comes to our mosque, we bring them and say, "Hey, look, here's a friendly FBI agent. Talk to them. If you hear anything suspicious, tell them." And he had gone to this mosque and said, "We are not spying on you. We will not put people in your mosque to spy on you." This was quoted, this was taped, and sure enough, this is what happens. And so it's sort of like a Saturday night skit. It really doesn't seem real to me that this happened. How could this happen? And you talk about impunity, with impunity, right? And so, interestingly, this one, and I see actually the names of one of the young men who was ultimately he was prosecuted. Well, actually, no. Charges were brought. He ultimately was not prosecuted. He was released after his life, of course, had been ruined and labeled a terrorist. No known prosecution or conviction at all of anyone after almost a year of very intensive interrogation, or very intensive investigation and undercover work by this agent. Okay, so that's really scary. Where are our dollars? I mean, it's scary on many levels. Where are our dollars going? What is the purpose of this type of work? Do we really have a relationship? What's the role of the federal government here? So on the one hand, we have the federal government that Muslims really need to think about and understand what their role is and how we play into that. We also have state level issues, right, which we have to think about. Anti-Sharia laws and legislation, which is ridiculous. I don't have time to deal with right now, but I can certainly talk about it and answer any questions. We also have mosque building issues. Right? A fundamental First Amendment right in this country, right to practice your religion, have a place of worship. Now, all of a sudden, on the municipal level, we're having to challenge, basic ordinances and say, look, you have a mosque across the street. Now, you have a church across the street. I can't have a mosque, six doors down. So, on various levels, we have the individual level, we have the organizational level, has been mentioned. Some of the organizations on here I'm familiar with. I know about it. I've written about them. I've researched them, right? This really has really not been successful. I guess I may have a different talk if, in fact, something of all of this, even despite the impunity, what would I say? What would I say? Oh, at least at the end you got terrorists. I'd have a hard time with that. But you'd have something to talk about. I don't have anything to talk about other than frustration. And the only optimistic thing I will say about this, I did write a short paper a couple years ago about the role of 9/11 and sort of how Muslims have come out of their shell in a way, because really no choice, right? And so what we've done as Americans is go to the courts and say, the rule says this, and I was terminated for this, and this is not lawful, right? So we win some of those cases, we lose a lot of those cases, but the cases are going to court. And so the little sliver of optimism is we're not hiding out as much as we used to. We are coming out and we are exercising our rights, at least some of us, and we're trying. And so I don't know what will come of it. If the rule of law doesn't mean anything, I guess I don't know at the end of the day. But I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that more of this will come out and more conversations. And it's not just about Muslims, right? It's about anyone who's really not in this elitist group that Glenn writes about. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I feel really humbled to be included in this panel, with people like Glenn and the other panelists. But you have to have the Latino guy, so that's why I invited you. Yeah, that's how it works. Yeah, I've been doing this for 12 years. Yeah, and I feel comfortable now within a crowd. Yeah. But,
Latinos, they can too.
yeah, that's right. But anyway, there are expressions that define certain conditions of people, like for instance, the rule of law. It's a very interesting expression. And there is another one that says you have the right to remain silent, right? And if you are in that position where a police officer is telling you you have the right to remain silent, that means that you don't have any fucking rights. That's it, right? Now, if you have some money, you can hire an attorney that will get things, go away. If you don't have any money, that's it. You can use the F word again, Yeah, and yes, I'm an immigrant from Argentina. And, I grew up during the dirty war in Argentina. For people that know about that, it was when the civil government had the experience of a coup d'etat by fascist military. And that was really painful. And when I see this list here, it comes to me all the wars that we have in the names of people, The one that comes to my mind is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., for instance, with so many lives there. And then talking about the Civil War here, so many thousands of people, killing each other for different reasons. And they were all speaking, some of them spoke English, some of them spoke German, and some other languages. But, and then looking at this, in my case, is the desaparecidos from Argentina. And from that particular time, 1957, 1956, and, torture, kidnapping, the people getting, against everybody. This neo-Nazi groups, against Jewish, against gays, against Muslims, against Jews, and they were kidnapping, killing, and torturing those people. They were not against blacks because we don't have many blacks in Argentina. Otherwise, they would be against blacks too. Because it's a sickness of the soul. Racism and all this violence that's going on. So when I hear about all these experiences, the only thing that I could, I survived that one. So I feel lucky that I'm here talking to you right now. But many of my friends are just names. Once in a while I Google them to see if they found their remains, or if somebody, it was found in Europe testifying against the general that was convicted, something like that, And like there was a kid here, I think he left. It's a family thing what happens, the tragedies. It was Hamoud's son. Our neighbor he's in federal prison now, he was here and he left. But I was going to recognize him, ask him if he wanted to talk or say something about his own case. But anyway, because many of us, we are aware of this situation with the rule of law and that the government is, sometimes it seems that it's not what we think that it should be, and things like that. And at the local level as well, when we see certain things that are happening, when the city council meets and they talk about things that bring a lot of controversy within the local population, sad situations as well, and there is always a little bit of racism, classism, and all other isms in between. And you get into what is called, at least for me, into the survival mode. You have to survive one more day so you can do something good. If you choose that way, you can choose the 8 to 5, go to work, 40 hours a week, keep silent, it doesn't matter who you pray to or whatever, and you do your job and you retire, then you die, and that's it. But some other people, all of a sudden they have an aha moment, perhaps. Some of them have time to write books, some others have time to rebel to their own institutions, some others get the cause of helping certain people. You have no choice, you have to do what you have to do. And for me, since I speak Spanish and English and I come from a Latin American country, I decided to work with our Latino families. And after doing that for many, many years, now we realize, as an organization, as a non-for-profit organization, grassroots, that we are serving the entire public, the general public, not only Latino people. We serve the minorities, the underserved, and right now we establish ourselves, we occupy a territory here in the neighborhood, in the first ward, the low-income neighborhood. So we occupy the corner, fix it up. We created a community place, where people can come in and volunteer and help in our programs. We work on health, education, legal access. And talking about legal access, we have a pro bono attorney, we have an immigration attorney that is helping. So since we Latinos sometimes are a problem for the institutions, we look for solutions. So one of our programs is immigration, and people that are being prosecuted because of a driving violation. So we decided to be a solution, and we worked hard for 1 year and applied through the Department of Justice to be able to provide immigration services. So that's what we are doing right now. We're helping people, families to be together, and we are helping residents to become citizens. And I think that we are doing a little bit of a good work in that sense, empowering our community, empowering our people. And because we are a very small organization, so that's what we can do with the resources we have. And we work every day. It's an ongoing thing. And we work with everybody. Everybody wants to work with us. We work with law enforcement. We work with the local police. We work with the FBI. We work with the immigration services. We did 2 years of anti-human trafficking, working as a community outreach. And right now we're doing health. We're working with the National Partnership for Action to eliminate health disparities. And that's my cup of tea. I'm a nurse, so I should work on health. That's what we are doing. But other things come to us, because of it's a one-on-one individual case. So every different family is a case, and we are working on that. We bring in awareness. And yes, indeed, you need to be very careful in the way that you do things, because it's not a matter of being afraid, but being aware and intelligent enough not to get caught. So, because that's what it is, maybe. I mean, you have to do the things that you have to do and survive one more day, because there is somebody waiting for me to notarize the translated birth certificate so they can apply for their kids to take advantage of the latest presidential decree in order to help Latin immigrants, young immigrants that came to this country when they were young, to be able to have employment or just to do something better with their lives and be able to go to college, etc., etc. You are all familiar with things like that. And one of the things that I'm really proud about our organization is that I love to see our Muslim students from the university coming over and volunteer to help with our after-school program. You know, and it is very nice. I do a little racial profiling. Whoever comes with a scarf on their head, it's a Muslim, and they say, "Salam alaikum." You know, yeah, maybe.
Like that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I travel. I visited North Africa when I was younger, and I absorbed different cultures, and I was lucky enough to travel a lot. You know, so I bring on that with me. But anyway, one of the ways to look for a solution, I would say, it is a community effort. Every individual should do something every day, but you have to get together with other people, otherwise it takes too long and it's not effective enough, the work, you know. So right now I have 3, 4, a few more friends. I don't know, some of them are recognized, some others might become new friends, you know, so that's it. But definitely it gives me hope to see that so many people are here with the common denominator of, yes, we do understand, Glenn, what you are talking about. Yes, we do. All right?
For you stalwarts, of course, I want to invite Glenn back up. I want to thank our panel for their comments, for adding questions for our panelists or for Glenn. Start right here.
I was wondering if any of you have received personal threats or intimidation or any other surveillance or anything like that directed at you or your organization that gives you cause for concern.
I shave every morning just in case somebody's filming me. I want to look good.
I can say yes to both of those. The American Civil Liberties Union of Eastern Missouri, my colleague John Chasnoff at the back, will attest to the fact that periodically we get threatening mail letters. I mean, because of the scope of the work that we do, we're inevitably going to offend somebody. You know, notwithstanding the fact that the protections of the Constitution extend to everybody. Some people don't like that. And then personally, relative to my law enforcement past, I have many friends who remain in law enforcement, but you can be sure that there are some people in law enforcement who have, whether jokingly or not, suggested, you know, the planet would be better without it. So, yeah.
When I was representing the imam, I was reasonably sure, and I think everybody else on the defense team was, that our phones were tapped. I think this is something that is routinely done in terrorism cases, is to tap the phones of the defense attorneys. But I've never been personally concerned about anything happening to me. I've never gotten any threats, in part because I think what Glenn was saying about fear, I mean, the basic product of what this is all about is fear. And we simply cannot give in to that fear. We simply have to just go ahead and do what we have to do. And, you know, I meet with people and I say, is this an FBI agent? Is this guy going to try to talk me into doing something illegal? I don't care. I just got to live my life. You can't give in to the fear, and that's the problem.
And I was just going to say, I think there was one letter, you know, between my husband and I that came to our home, and that was very disturbing. What's more disturbing is the stuff that our clients and friends share with us about what they get in their homes, and other websites, you know, really vindictive, hateful type of material. And so, of course, we have contacts with the FBI, so we refer them to the FBI. We don't know what happens after that, but thankfully nothing to speak of.
I would like Glenn Greenwald to comment on what I would consider illiberal uses of the rule of law. It was constantly invoked, for example, by anti-immigrant activists who wanted the president to apply the rule of law to those young people that were eligible for his declining to prosecute deportation cases. I mean, are there bad uses of this concept of the rule of law?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
obviously, if you have a regime of bad laws, then rigid application of law is something that will actually breed greater injustice. And that's the reason why, for example, most political philosophers and I think even Western nations recognize the place for civil disobedience, because you don't want to set up this sort of religious sacredness around law, because law itself cannot be an instrument to worsen all of these problems. And so when I talk about the supremacy of the rule of law, I don't mean to suggest at all that simply blindly following legal stricture is the exclusive way that a society can achieve justice for exactly the reason that you just suggest. But I think that if you go back to what John Adams, the sort of dichotomy that he observed, which is that as a generalized principle, you have only two options. You can either say that you will live in general under law as supreme, as Thomas Paine said, to the extent there's a monarch in America, let a crown be placed on the head of law and declare that law is king, because the alternative is to have a monarchy or a tyranny or a society where power reigns. And so, there is no perfect and absolute system that doesn't permit deviations, and that includes law. Law can actually be an oppressive regime, but it's the only real alternative to having some kind of ordered and just society.
Over the back.
Yeah, Mr. Greenwald, I appreciate your distinction between violation and repudiation of the rule of law, but I wonder if you're a little too kind to American history. Think back to McCarthyism, Palmer raids, back to St. Louis, where we had the Dred Scott decision, and the judge said that no black man has rights, but the white man has to respect. It seems to me that there has been repudiation of law, the rule of law throughout our history, and I wonder if the rule of law has just been a thin veneer. And my question is, does it seem different to us now because this is our time and so it's more vivid because of the media, or is it because white people have finally fallen in the
Yeah, those are all good questions. I mean, I think there is a bias to believing that problems that are contemporary are worse than problems that have taken place in the past, in part because problems that are contemporary are the ones that affect us. So being human, we tend to think that problems that affect us are worse than problems that don't. So there is that bias inherent in how we view history versus contemporary afflictions. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was very clear about the fact that violations of the rule of law in American history are not ancillary side matters. They're often sort of central to how American history was shaped. They were violent and fundamental breaches, not ones that just sort of were isolated on the side. In fact, the nation was born as a violation of that principle. So I don't mean when I draw this dichotomy at all to minimize or trivialize just how radical those breaches were. Nonetheless, I mean, if you look even at the harshest critics of the United States, both contemporary politics and even its history, most people will agree that the history of the United States has been one of very painful and incremental, though inexorable, progress in lots of these areas. I mean, it just simply is the case that no matter how horrendous conditions are for racial minorities in the United States, it is better than the time 150 years ago when they were owned and sold as chattel. It is indisputably true that if you look at the conditions of women, though far from equal in lots of ways, it is radically better than times when they were denied the right to vote in any other civic right. Certainly that's true for gays, for Native Americans, for lots of different groups. And I think the one thing that explains that social progress, which is far from inevitable, lots of countries have gone backwards in lots of those areas, is that this principle has remained vibrant. That doesn't mean that I'm not at all suggesting you can't find instances in the past where people, including prominent people on the Supreme Court, rejected the essence of the rule of law. Of course that's the case. But I think its vibrancy is really what animated all of that progress that I just referenced in a way that I think that we've now lost. And so I do think it's a pretty radical difference, but ultimately at the end of the day, like when people go and say, okay, here's the radical difference. This is something that's really bad now, and here's why it's different than in the past. In some sense, it's really just a rhetorical device for getting people to pay attention. You know, if we're saying, this evil that I'm talking about is new and different, so you should really care about it. Ultimately, I'm not really that interested in whether things now are radically different than they were in the past. What matters to me is, are things now sufficiently bad that they warrant action? You know, it's the sort of thing that you do when you write a book to try and have a hook. Like you say, here's why what I'm writing about is totally new. And I think it is, for the reasons I've said. You may be right, you make a good argument that it's really more of a continuum, the idea of violation and repudiation, rather than this sharp dichotomy that I'm drawing. But ultimately, to me, it doesn't much matter. What matters is that there are these evils in our society that demand redress. And whether it was better or worse 200 years ago or different, doesn't concern me quite as much as being clear about what we're now facing.
Stay over here too. Let's go one second.
I was thinking of John Adams, you know, the man you quoted, the founding father. He Alien Sedition Act, 1798 got passed, a couple people got prosecuted. And it's just, there's an H.L. Mencken quote that's just bouncing around in my mind. I'm paraphrasing, but it was something about the Supreme Court. They passed some law in like 1912, or it might have been involving Eugene Debs, and he threw out the quote, "You have to be a lawyer to misunderstand the law that clearly." And I don't want to point fingers in anyone's face, but it's a fact that if you guys become lawyers, I'm not a student here, but if you become lawyers, you hold power. And you can change people's lives for better or for ill. And I'm just wondering, like, it ends up lawyers always sound like, they almost sound like priests arguing about, you know, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And you have guys like John Yoo and David Addington, whose ideas have become bipartisan, that Obama has taken and escalated. Like Noam Chomsky says, you know, it used to be you just got tortured, now you get murdered by a plane flying in the sky. Like, it's just how, like, do you think that's going to change? Like, is there going to be a reformation where people don't talk about angels dancing on the head of a pin?
Yeah, I mean, let me just, you know, I'm interested in what the panel has to say about this, but I want to reference them in answering the question. I mean, basically, if you look at the panel, there's, you know, two lawyers on the panel and someone who just got done working with the ACLU, who have sort of dedicated their lives not to fighting about these kind of how many angels can dance on the head of a pin questions, but to combating these injustices, not in, you know, a 9-to-5 way, but dedicating their lives to doing it. The organizations they represent have done so at great personal risk and cost to themselves in order to combat them as well. So I think it's important not to overgeneralize, but, you know, but what I would say is that there are lots of things. I mean, one of the things that the founders realized is that these rights that they were guaranteeing would be meaningless if there weren't a whole bunch of checks and safeguards to prevent their erosion. And there are a lot of institutions that are supposed to prevent their erosion which have radically failed. Not just the legal profession, but the judiciary, as I said earlier, the idea of an independent press, the idea that the three political branches would check each other and would prevent any kind of serious transgressions. Lots of them, I'd say almost all of them, have failed. But within each of them, there are individuals who have really, at great personal expense, worked pretty heroically to try and to pursue these principles and defend them. And I think it's important to sort of be aware of that, because within those acts lies what I was describing earlier as sort of the hope for optimism. The fact that human beings are capable and obviously are very willing to stand up to these sorts of things and do what's necessary to change.
I'm sorry, the first thought that came to my mind was, don't put us in the same boat as those.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, that's legitimate.
John Hughes is a terrible guy.
Free speech, all good, but you know, just as I say to people about being Muslim, we're not all the same, you know, not all lawyers are the same. We all do different things, we use our skills in different ways, and you can be one of the good guys, you know.
I might just add to Jen and what Glenn said earlier about how the courts have seemed to have abandoned their role as the arbiter for how the Bill of Rights and our basic things are supposed to be decided. And certainly as a practicing lawyer, having gone through a lot of these cases, I've been astonished to see the kinds of decisions that come out in which by twisting words, they make black seems to be like white and justice is injustice and so on.
Making murder respectable, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I think I grew up in a time in which the courts were supposed to be the arbiters of this, between the government and the people. And I've seen that now gone. I don't see that happening anymore, and I'm not sure how to get that back. And I don't know who is the arbiters anymore except you, all of you. And that's why it is so important that we get together, that we talk to each other, that we reject the whole idea of the fear that keeps us from talking to our neighbor and saying something is not right here. We need to do that, and that's why I'm so delighted to see this huge crowd come out here, because it just means so many more people that we can talk to the truth to, unlike the media, and you can go and tell people. So please be very active, do a lot of talking. This is important.
Sorry.
I kind of just want to also piggyback. I heard your question, but he failed to identify himself. That was my colleague, John Chasnoff, the previous question from the HCID. And it was something that I was touching on earlier too. That's something, I wish I knew exactly how to say it, but I think that's something very important about acknowledging that, like I said earlier, I think your talk here this evening was the best I've heard it put about present day conditions. But there's something about acknowledging the reality that it's nothing new. There's always been, I would argue, a repudiation, to use your word, a repudiation of the rule of law as it affects some people on this soil. And there's something important about our ability to acknowledge that while indicting no one present. We were born into that reality, that I think will allow us to begin addressing the kind of thing that you're talking about, which we've seen up close in the most horrific ways. Prosecutorial misconduct that you wouldn't believe. Police abuse that you would not believe, with impunity, because there has been this repudiation of the rule of law as it applied to certain rules in the country from its inception, and it was acceptable. And I think it's very difficult to talk about that because in mainstream settings, it upsets the narrative. That pisses people off more than most patriots get pissed off more than anything else when you upset the narrative of the country. What we are, what we've been, what we aspire to be. When you hit them with the hard evidence of what has actually happened, that's when things go bad. But like I said, I think this generation that is here now, the new generation coming up in the world that we live in, that's become smaller, their interactions have become greater with other cultures from around the world. I think a standard of equally valuing people in every process that we have is attainable if you don't give up the fight.
We're going to take about 5 more minutes of questions. I know I'm going to, how shall we say, upset a few people because we're not going to get all these questions in, and I apologize for that. So I'm going to start here first. You can go first, and then you can go.
Okay, well, this my question was, could you please comment on the increasing presence of privatized prisons in the United States, and what implications do they have in our country?
Yeah, I think they have a huge presence, a huge impact, and it's true for this reason. If you look at how, did someone not hear the question? Is that the question was, what is the impact of the privatized prison industry and the increasing privatization of the prison industry? If you look at how politicians typically make decisions and to whom they listen, to which constituencies, they tend to listen to constituencies that can punish or reward them, and they tend to ignore ones that lack that power. And you see this all the time. There's lots of one-sided debates because only one side of the debate has that power. And that's definitely true when it comes to things like prison reform, reform of drug laws, liberalization of sentencing guidelines. You have a few advocates, like the people here, who advocate for better laws in this regard. But they don't really have lots of institutional power to punish politicians who don't do the things that they want or who do things that they don't like. But on the other side, you have this increasingly powerful industry, the private prison industry, that really, it's amazing. I mean, like any other business that profits the more customers that they get, the privatized prison industry profits the more prisoners they get. The more of our fellow citizens are put into their cages, the more profit they make. And so one of the things that they are most interested in doing is ensuring that more and more people become their customers, meaning are in prison. And so whenever there is proposed reform of drug laws or penal sanctions or flexibility in sentencing, they pay lobbyists and donate money to lots of members of the state legislatures and federal government to lobby against them. And it's extremely difficult to overcome that because there's no corresponding lobby on the other side urging them to do the right thing. And not only are they blocking these reforms, but they're using their power to expand their power also. If you look at a chart of how many people are in private prisons in the United States, it's just a very steep increase. And beyond the fact that, like when you privatize anything, the only thing they tend to care about is the profit of their shareholders, not the welfare of the prisoners. So people in privatized prisons are suffering from even worse and more oppressive conditions than people in public prisons. They're treated more harshly. It's a horrendous problem, and it's very difficult to figure a way out because there's no constituency. This is something that's happened in lots of different countries. There's an article in this week's Economist, actually, that is really hard to read about the state of prisons in Latin America. I live in Brazil. Brazil has probably one of the worst prison systems in the world, where there's something like 13 or 14 more inmates in each cell than it was designed for. And this is the problem all around the world as resources are limited and certain resources have to be taken away. People who are either in prison or who are charged with crimes are pretty much the people who are going to be the first to have those resources taken away. And privatizing, putting the people into cages as profit and then making them engage in basically slave labor, it's what Alexander calls it, the new Jim Crow, aptly, is becoming a very severe problem, and it provides its own impetus. It's very hard to fight against.
Just real quick, 1 out of every 3 at this point, African American males born today is expected to spend time in prison. We're looking at the commodification of a whole community, particularly those in the urban core who are impoverished. You have an organization called Corrections Corporation of America that is going around the country as we speak. It's hard economic times, not just for individuals, but for governments all over the country. They go to state legislatures everywhere and say, hey man, we can help you balance your budget. We can take away some of your significant costs relative to imprisoning your people. All we ask is that you guarantee us 90% occupancy of those prisons. So to me, I know who they mean. When I look at the disparities in sentencing, when I look at the severe inequities at every step of the process, I think I know who they mean. I think I know that there's a reason why we think 1 out of every 3 African American males born today will spend time in prison. So I think it has a severe impact on our societal stability. When you attack a segment of your population like that, you're bound to create instability everywhere, ultimately.
Thank you. This is a slightly different kind of question, but are you familiar with a book by Stephen Pinker, The Angels of Our Better Selves?
I don't think so.
Well, it's a very interesting book that talks about the long-term curve in the decline of violence over centuries. And I'm not suggesting that it should in any way make people less concerned about the issues you raise and the need to act now. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I am suggesting that if one thinks about it, you see, there's some of the statements here say, oh, it's also gloomy. We're going to go away and we're not going to feel that there's anything in particular to be done. But if one can think about the long-term trend of violence being in decline, it does introduce a note of optimism underneath what you're talking about without changing the dynamic of what needs to be done now to deal with what's going on there. So I just wanted to
optimistic note by citing the original Tea Party, by citing the Occupy movement, and I think by implication, the Arab Spring, so-called. And it's certainly the case that at least in Egypt and Tunisia, one of the most powerful motivators of the people who participated in that was a total lack of economic opportunity. These people were at their wits' end, they were educated, and they had nowhere to go to make a living. And I think you can see that beginning to happen in Greece, in Spain, but not at this point yet in the prosperous United States. To quote Bob Dylan, when you got nothing, you got nothing to lose. And we're not there yet. Would you comment, perhaps all of you, on the relevance and importance of our economic position in the apathy that appears to affect the average American when confronting the obvious problems that you're all discussing?
Sorry, you mentioned Arabs, so I took an interest there. All right, so when people talk about Egypt, Egypt has 80 million people. Okay, I'm from Egypt originally, so 80 million people, very high employment rate. You're right, we're a very high educated community. And actually, if you look at the data, I don't have it with me, very high percentage of the population, highly educated males between ages of like 18 to 25, right? Very dangerous levels of educated males sitting around the streets doing nothing, okay? And having a president who's been in power for many, many years, you know. So it was a series of things, and it took a long time. And people think Egypt was the first country to start the Arab Spring, and it wasn't, right? It's just the notoriety and what people think of in this country, Egypt being a leader, and it is in many ways, though it was not the first to rise up, even though its economic situation is horrific. And it's going to take a long time. Democracy for them is going to take a long, long time. Democracy here, we're still having tensions over what is democracy in this country. Do we exhibit those characteristics today? So, you know, will we get to the point of, I mean, it's such a different, you know, the Arab world is so different. You know, you know, here we have sort of the facade, at least, of something. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but some people do have rights in this country, not just the 1%. Others have some rights in this country, and so it's hard when you have a middle class that isn't necessarily targeted in the way that others are to say, well, we should give this up and do something else. That's very hard. And what you lack in Egypt and many of these Arab countries is a middle class. You know, it was 90 and 10, you know, so that lack of middle class, when more and more went to the bottom, I think John and others mentioned this, as you have more people falling into this lower tier, then you can maybe have this rising. I don't see that happening at the same level just because of the history and dynamics of that region.
Yeah, I can just mention, as a head of an organization that's trying to raise money to get relief for some of the people we got in jail here, I'm struck by how little money there is on the left. It's bad enough fighting the 10 or 20 people that each contribute $1 billion to Islamophobia, the manufacturing of the Islamophobic fears that go on in the country. But it's another thing to also fight them plus the government. And between the two, you're fighting a very heavily well-financed group, and everybody else on the other side is really struggling to catch up. I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'm hoping that one of the things that will come out of this election is the idea that you cannot entirely buy elections. No matter how much money you pump in, there is still enough residual. There's still enough residual integrity in the American people that they will reject this, and that is one of the ways we're going to fight back is simply in this kind of a forum, getting the word out and having it resonate. And certainly our message is resonating. Everywhere we go, people pick up on it. So it's the only thing I can see is how we fight back against this, because we are not going to get the money.
All right, last question.
Well, you touched on this, but I think it's worth noting that the reason our country is the #1 prisoner of people in the history of this planet, primary reason for the explosion of incarceration with a disproportionate effect clearly on the poor and minority is drug prohibition. Do you agree that drug prohibition should be repealed or at least radically reformed?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually did a study on the one country in the West that has actually decriminalized all narcotics, which is Portugal, and they did it in 2000. And if you just look at pure data, and what was interesting about Portugal was they're a pretty poor country, especially now, but even in 2000, and they have this out-of-control drug problem. And they convened this commission of apolitical experts, and they said, what is it that we can do to arrest these problems? They had drug addicts laying in the street in Lisbon, astronomical rates of sexually transmitted diseases and drug-related deaths. And the more they criminalized, the more they imprisoned people, the worse the problem became. So they actually were desperate, and they said, what is it that we can do? We want you to consider every option, except for full-scale legalization, because treaties bar them from doing that, and they're a small country, so they actually have to abide by treaties. And so they couldn't do that, but they every other option. And what this panel came back and said was the solution to this problem is to decriminalize. And it was sort of counterintuitive. People thought, well, how can decriminalizing drugs possibly solve the problem of drug addiction and huge numbers of youth doing drugs? Aren't we going to be sending the signal that it's okay? Aren't we going to have turning Lisbon into a drug haven? 10 years later, in every single category, literally, by every metric, it's this astronomical success. It was incredibly controversial in Portugal when it was introduced in 2000. Now there's zero call for the reinstatement of drug prohibition. And the reason that this has happened, and if you go and talk to drug policymakers there like I did, for this paper, what they'll say is that, and it relates to what I was talking about earlier, when you are the government and you are seen by drug addicts and poor communities as being the force that jails them, there is a wall of fear that gets erected between the government and the citizenry. Once you remove that wall, then government officials are able to go into communities and educate them on the perils of drug use, on how to get off drugs. And much more importantly, when you stop spending enormous sums of money on prosecuting and arresting and caging people for drug addiction, for what is a health problem, and instead start using that money for drug treatment programs, for methadone clinics, for clean needles, you fix almost every problem related to drug pathology. Once you take out that moral equation, the moral question from the equation, which is, is drug use a good or a bad thing? Drug decriminalization, really legalization, becomes the only rational course of action. But the problem is what this gentleman asked earlier about privatization and the drug criminalization, prohibition, is an incredibly profitable enterprise for lots of different factions, not just the private prison industry, but also for the government. It's what enables the police to go into communities and basically arrest people at will, to do stop and frisk. It empowers too many people in order for rationality to prevail. But it's absolutely one of the core reforms necessary to solve this sprawling penal.
Like I do, these conversations always hate to come to an end, but inevitably they must. So I thank you for your presence, and I thank our panelists one more time, and our speakers for